The Epic of Gilgamesh, the story that was told before all others. Before Homer wrote the Iliad, before Moses parted the Red Sea, before the pyramids of Egypt cast their first shadow across the desert sand, before almost everything you were ever taught in school about the ancient world, there was a story. It was pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus, line by line, in a language so old that the people who wrote it had no word for the concept of a story. It was copied and recopied across 2,000 years by scribes who understood, in the way scribes always understand, that what they were preserving was something that could not be allowed to disappear. It told of a king who was 2/3 God and 1/3 man, a king who built walls, conquered monsters, insulted a goddess, watched his best friend die, and then walked to the edge of the world searching for the one thing no human being has ever found. It told of a man who wanted to live forever. And what makes this story extraordinary, what makes it arguably the most important story ever written, is not what Gilgamesh found at the end of his journey, it is what he didn't find, and what that absence taught him, and what it still teaches us 4,000 years later, if we are willing to listen. This is the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest story on earth, and it begins, as all the most honest stories do, with a tyrant. The city of Uruk rose from the flat alluvial plain of ancient Mesopotamia, what we now call southern Iraq, sometime around 2,700 years before the birth of Christ. By the standards of its time, it was enormous. Tens of thousands of people crowded inside its massive walls, which stretched for nearly 10 kilometers around a city of temples, workshops, granaries, and markets. The Euphrates River ran nearby, giving life to the surrounding farmland, and at the city's center, a great ziggurat, a stepped temple tower, rose toward the sky like a mountain built by human hands, because Uruk had no mountains and needed one. It was, in every sense that mattered, the most advanced city on earth. And its king was the most powerful man alive. His name was Gilgamesh. The ancient texts describe him with the kind of language that makes you suspect the authors were genuinely terrified of the person they were writing about. He was said to be 2/3 divine. His mother was the goddess Ninsun, his father a mortal king, and this partial divinity expressed itself in everything about him: his height, his strength, his beauty, his absolute, unconditional certainty that the rules which governed ordinary human beings simply did not apply to him. He was not wrong about the strength. He was catastrophically wrong about the rules. Gilgamesh ran Uruk the way only young, brilliant, physically overwhelming people who have never been told no can run anything, with total disregard for the cost to those around him. He worked his people to exhaustion, building monuments and walls. He took whatever he wanted. When a young man was to be married, Gilgamesh exercised a king's claimed right to spend the wedding night with the bride before her husband could. He didn't do this because he particularly wanted every bride in Uruk. He did it because he could. Because no one could stop him. Because the gap between what Gilgamesh was and what everyone else was seemed, to Gilgamesh, to justify a gap between what he was permitted and what anyone else was permitted. The people of Uruk groaned under his reign, and eventually, as people always do when they have no other option, they prayed. They prayed to Anu, the sky god. They told him what was happening. They asked for help. And Anu, to his credit, listened. The goddess Aruru took clay from the earth and pressed it in her hands and breathed life into what she made. What she made was not a weapon, was not an army, was not a plague or a flood or any of the other instruments the gods typically deployed when they wanted to correct a problem among human beings. What she made was a man, a specific kind of man. A man who had never seen a city, who had never worn clothes, who ran with the gazelles on the steppe and drank from the same watering holes as the wild animals, and had never once in his life been told what he was not allowed to do, not because he was a tyrant, but because he lived beyond the reach of kings, beyond the reach of rules, beyond the reach of civilization itself. His name was Enkidu. Enkidu was everything Gilgamesh was not. Where Gilgamesh was polished, Enkidu was raw. Where Gilgamesh operated within systems of power and used those systems to crush the people beneath him, Enkidu existed outside all systems entirely. His body was covered in hair. He moved through the wilderness with the unconscious grace of an animal that has never been afraid because it has never needed to be. A hunter found his tracks first, saw him at the watering holes, running with the animals, was afraid, not of Enkidu specifically, but of what Enkidu represented. Something that should not exist. A man who was not a man, or a man who was nothing but man, stripped of every layer of civilization that usually separates human beings from the rest of the living world. The hunter went to Gilgamesh and told him what he had seen. And Gilgamesh, because Gilgamesh was, under everything else, profoundly intelligent, understood immediately that the solution to Enkidu was not force. You don't send soldiers after something that runs with gazelles and frightens hunters just by existing. You send something more disruptive. Something that would pull Enkidu out of the wilderness and into the world of human beings, whether he wanted to come or not. He sent Shamat, a woman of the temple, a sacred courtesan, into the wilderness to find Enkidu. And what happened next is the oldest recorded example of what we might now call civilization's most fundamental act. The moment a wild thing is brought inside and shown what it means to be human. Shamat and Enkidu were together for 7 days. 7 days is a long time. Long enough, apparently, for something fundamental to shift. When Enkidu rose on the 8th day and turned back toward the watering hole, the animals fled. They did not recognize him anymore. Whatever he had been, the wordless, boundary-free creature that ran with gazelles, was gone. In its place was something new, something that needed bread and wine and clothing and conversation, something that, for the first time in its life, needed other people. Enkidu had become human, and humanity, once it takes root, cannot be undone. He came to Uruk looking for a fight. He had heard, through Shamhat and through travelers, about the king of this great city, and what that king was doing to his people, to the brides on their wedding nights, to the young men worked to exhaustion on the walls. And something in Enkidu, this man who had lived his entire life without hierarchy, without a king above him telling him what was permitted, found the situation intolerable in a way that someone born inside civilization might not. He hadn't been trained from birth to accept the idea of a king. He had no framework for why one man's desires should override everyone else's lives. So he walked into Uruk and planted himself in front of a wedding procession and refused to let Gilgamesh through the door. What happened next is one of the great moments in all of literature. The two most powerful men in the world grabbed each other and fought. They fought the way earthquakes fight, with the full weight of what they were pressing against each other, neither yielding, neither capable of yielding, the stones of the doorway cracking under their combined force. They fought until they were both exhausted, until neither one could lift his arms, until the only thing left between them, when the violence finally drained away, was something neither had ever experienced before. Recognition. Two men, equally matched, equally alone in the way that extraordinary people are always alone, because there is no one else who exists at the same altitude, no one else who can meet them where they live, looking at each other across the rubble of their contest and understanding simultaneously, this is the one. They became brothers, not in blood, in something deeper than blood, the bond that forms between people who have tested each other to the absolute limit and found that the other did not break. Gilgamesh had never had a friend. Enkidu had never had an equal. Between them, across the next years, they built something neither had known was possible, and then the gods took it away. Before it ended, there were adventures, extraordinary ones. Together they traveled to the Cedar Forest, a distant, forbidden place guarded by Humbaba, a monstrous creature appointed by the god Enlil to protect the ancient trees. Gilgamesh proposed the journey. Enkidu argued against it with everything he had. He knew Humbaba, had heard the demon's voice in the wilderness, understood on a cellular level what they were walking toward. But Gilgamesh had a reason that could not be argued with. If I fall, he said, at least I will have made a name that endures. This is the first time in the story, and perhaps the first time in all of human literature, that a character explicitly acknowledges mortality and chooses glory as the answer to it. Gilgamesh was not ignorant of death, he was terrified of it. And his response to that terror at this point in his life was the only response he knew. Do something so extraordinary that the world would remember you long after your body was gone. They went to the Cedar Forest. They fought Humbaba. With help from Shamash the sun god, who loved Gilgamesh and sent 8 winds to pin the monster down, they killed him. They cut the great trees and floated them back to Uruk on a raft down the Euphrates. Gilgamesh cleaned the blood from his body in the river and dressed himself in his finest clothes, and the goddess Ishtar saw him and desired him. What followed was a masterpiece of catastrophic overconfidence. Ishtar offered Gilgamesh marriage. Gilgamesh, freshly victorious, riding the specific kind of recklessness that comes from having just killed a divinely appointed guardian and gotten away with it, declined. He didn't just decline. He listed, in meticulous detail, every previous lover of Ishtar's and what had happened to them. The bird with the broken wing, the lion hunted in pits, the horse whipped bloody, the shepherd turned into a wolf. One by one, every person and creature who had loved this goddess and been destroyed by that love. It was the most devastating rejection in the history of mythology. It was also, given who he was rejecting, an act of breathtaking stupidity. Ishtar went to her father Anu in tears and fury and demanded the bull of heaven. Anu tried to warn her about the consequences. She didn't care. The bull of heaven came down to Uruk, and with 3 snorts of its breath, it opened the earth and swallowed hundreds of warriors into the pit. Gilgamesh and Enkidu killed it. They cut off its heart and offered it to Shamash and threw the bull's thigh in Ishtar's face. The gods convened. 2 divine creatures had now been killed, Humbaba and the bull of heaven. Both appointed by gods. Both destroyed by these 2 men. Someone had to pay for it. And it couldn't be Gilgamesh, because Gilgamesh was 2/3 divine, because his mother Ninsun sat in the divine assembly, because the threads of protection around him were too tightly woven to cut cleanly. So they cut Enkidu instead. He fell sick over 12 days, each day worse than the last. He raged at first, cursed the hunter who found him, cursed Shamhat who civilized him, cursed the day he came to Uruk. But in his delirium, he dreamed of the underworld, the house of dust and darkness where the dead go, and when he woke from that dream, the rage was gone. What replaced it was something quieter and infinitely more terrifying: acceptance. Gilgamesh sat beside him and held his hands and watched him go. He had never lost anything before. He had never loved anything before. Not truly. Not the way you love something that can be taken from you. The grief that broke over him when Enkidu died was not the grief of a man who knew how to grieve. It was the grief of someone encountering loss for the first time without any of the frameworks that people normally build across a lifetime to manage it. He refused to accept it. He walked out of Uruk into the wilderness, wearing a lion's skin, his long hair tangled, his royal clothes abandoned. He had been changed. Something in him that had been whole was broken, and he knew with perfect clarity what had broken it and what was the only possible cure. He had to find a way to never die. What followed was the longest journey in the ancient world. Gilgamesh walked to the mountains at the edge of the earth, Mashu, guarded by scorpion men whose heads touched the sky and whose terror was such that no mortal had ever passed them. He told them his name and his purpose. They looked at him, this wreck of a man, unkempt and grief-destroyed, the greatest king in the world reduced to something barely recognizable. And they let him through, because what else do you do with someone who has already been broken by something you cannot add to? He walked through 12 hours of complete darkness inside the mountain, 1 hour at a time, the darkness pressing against him from all sides. No light, no sound, nothing. He kept walking. Because what was darkness compared to what he had already lost? He emerged into a garden by the sea, a garden of jewels, carnelian and lapis lazuli, and every precious stone growing like fruit on crystalline trees, the light refracting through them in colors that had no names. He walked through it because he had not come for jewels. He found Siduri, a tavern keeper who lived at the edge of the sea, and told her what he was looking for. She said what everyone who truly cared about him said, in slightly different words: "You cannot find what you're looking for." The gods kept immortality for themselves when they made humanity. Eat and drink and love and be loved, because that is what was given to you, and it is more than nothing, which is what everything becomes in the end. He would not listen. He never listened to this advice, though everyone gave it, because the grief inside him was too loud and too recent for wisdom to compete with it. He found Ur-Shanabi the ferryman and crossed the waters of death, waters that would kill any living thing they touched, except Gilgamesh, who used long poles to push the boat without letting his hands make contact, using one pole and then another and another, as each one was contaminated and discarded, until at last he stood at the bow with empty hands and simply willed the boat forward across the remaining distance. He found Utnapishtim, the one man in all the world who had been granted immortality by the gods, the survivor of the great flood that had destroyed humanity, the man who held the secret Gilgamesh had crossed the world to find. And Utnapishtim told him the truth, not gently, directly. He told Gilgamesh the story of the flood first, how the gods had decided to destroy humanity, how the wise god Ea had warned him in a dream, how he had built a great boat and loaded it with his family and every living creature, and survived the 7 days of waters while everything else drowned. How when the waters receded, the gods regretted what they had done and gave Utnapishtim and his wife the gift of eternal life as recompense. And then he looked at Gilgamesh and said, "That was a unique circumstance that will never be repeated. The gods made a mistake and corrected it with a gift they never intended to give. What makes you think they will make the same mistake twice?" "For you?" Gilgamesh had no answer. He had crossed the world and the waters of death and the darkness inside the mountain for an answer. And the answer was no. But Utnapishtim, perhaps out of pity, perhaps out of something more complicated, told him of a plant that grew at the bottom of the sea. It could not grant immortality, but it could restore youth. He called it, "The old man becomes young again." It wasn't the answer Gilgamesh came for, but it was something. He tied stones to his feet and sank to the bottom of the sea and cut the plant from the rocks with his bleeding hands and rose back to the surface with it clutched against his chest. He was going to bring it back to Uruk. Give it to the elders first, he thought. Test it, see if it worked, then take it himself. He stopped to rest beside a pool on the journey home. He laid the plant down. He slept. A snake came from the water and smelled the plant and ate it. When the snake left, it shed its skin, emerging renewed, young again. The plant was gone. The snake had gotten what Gilgamesh had gone to the end of the world to find, and it had gotten it by accident while he was sleeping because he put it down. He sat beside the pool and wept. Not the wild, raging grief of after Enkidu's death. Something quieter, something that sounded, if you listened closely enough, like understanding. He went home. He went home to Uruk, to the city he had built, and the walls that would outlast him. And for the first time in the story, he looked at what was already there. He showed the walls to Ur-Shanabi, the ferryman who had accompanied him back. He described the craftsmanship, the lapis lazuli, the fired brick, the 1 league of city and 1 league of gardens and the half league of the temple precinct of Ishtar. He wasn't showing off anymore. He was showing someone else what he had been too self-absorbed and too terrified to see for himself. He had built something that would last. Not forever. Nothing lasts forever. And Gilgamesh now understood this in a way he had not before. But long enough to matter, long enough to outlast the grief and the fear and the desperate journey to the edge of the world. The story was written on 12 clay tablets by a scribe named Sinleki Unini, sometime between 1300 and 1000 years before the birth of Christ. It was buried in the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh and forgotten for 2000 years until a young Englishman named George Smith found the tablets in the British Museum in the 1870s, taught himself cuneiform, and translated them, and in doing so discovered that the flood story in the Bible was not unique, that there was an older version, that the Bible itself was drawing on stories that came from Mesopotamia, from Sumer, from the same valley between the Tigris and Euphrates where human civilization first scratched its name into wet clay and dared the world to forget it. The world forgot it anyway. For 2,000 years, Gilgamesh was no one, less than no one, a name pressed into crumbling tablets in a storeroom that no one visited, in a museum in a city that didn't exist when the story was first told. And then George Smith brushed the dust from a clay tablet and started to read, and the oldest story on earth came back. It came back with everything intact, the grief, still raw after 4,000 years, the friendship between two people who found in each other the one thing the world hadn't given them, someone equal. The terror of watching that person die and understanding for the first time that you are next, the desperate journey that follows, and the impossible question it carries. Is there a way out of this? Is there a door somewhere in the fabric of reality through which a person can walk and come out the other side, changed, untouchable, no longer subject to the rule that applies to everyone else? The answer, then as now, is no. The plant at the bottom of the sea will be eaten by a snake while you sleep. The waters of death will return your boat to the shore you came from. The darkness inside the mountain is 12 hours long, and there is nothing to do but walk. But the walls you built while you were afraid will still be standing. The friend you loved while you had them will have been real. The story you pressed into clay in the middle of the night, hoping someone somewhere on the other side of time would find it and recognize themselves in it, that story will survive. Gilgamesh has been dead for 4,700 years. His city is a mound of compacted earth on the Iraqi plain, and archaeologists are still excavating it. His walls have crumbled to dust, and the dust has been compressed back into the ground from which it came. But you know his name. You know what he lost, and what he searched for, and what he found instead. You know what kept him walking through the dark. That is not immortality. It is the other thing. The thing that was available all along, if only he had looked at his own walls instead of toward the horizon. It is enough.